All right, Melania Trump thought she was untouchable for years. She stood behind the cameras, behind the curtains, behind the carefully constructed image of the perfect political wife. Pearls pressed, smile measured, words almost never spoken. She built her silence into armor, and for a long time it worked. But last week, inside a closed room that very few people knew about, Melania Trump opened her mouth. And what came out didn't just ripple through Washington, it detonated. Because here's what nobody is telling you. This wasn't a press conference. This wasn't a polished statement released through her office. This was testimony, recorded, documented, and now in the hands of people who know exactly what to do with it. The moment everyone's been speculating about for 3 years just happened. And the version you're going to hear from mainstream media, it's missing the most important part, the part that changes everything. So let's talk about what really happened. Because when you understand the full picture, when you see what led to this moment and what comes next, you'll realize this isn't just a political story. This is a story about power, silence, and what happens when the most carefully guarded woman in America finally decides she has nothing left to lose. You have to go back to understand where this starts. Not to the campaign, not even to the White House. You have to go back to a woman who came to this country with almost nothing, built herself into something extraordinary, and then made the single most consequential decision of her life. She married Donald Trump. For decades, Melania operated by one rule: say nothing that can be used against you. It's not a small thing when you understand the world she moved through. The legal agreements, the public scrutiny, the years of being dissected by strangers who reduced her to a photograph, a facial expression, a hand that didn't quite hold. She watched from the inside as investigation after investigation circled closer. Mueller, the Manhattan DA, New York's Attorney General, federal prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. Every time, she stayed quiet. Every time, the political machine around her husband absorbed the blow and kept moving. But something changed after January 6th. People close to Melania have said it for years, quietly, off the record. She wasn't the same. The woman who'd survived the tabloids in the tower and 2 years of global media attention under a microscope, something cracked after that day. Not visibly, not publicly. But internally, sources say, she started making calculations that had nothing to do with her husband's political future. She started thinking about her own, and that's when the story really begins. Because everything that happened in that closed room last week was years in the making. Here's what the public record tells us. Federal investigators working across multiple ongoing cases have been quietly building a picture that goes far beyond what's been charged. This is standard practice. Prosecutors gather information from every possible source before deciding what to charge, who to charge, and how to use what they have. It's methodical, it's slow, and it almost never generates headlines until the moment it does. Melania Trump has, until recently, maintained strict legal distance from the various investigations swirling around her husband. Her lawyers are some of the best in the country. She has said almost nothing publicly that could be construed as relevant testimony. She has maintained, with extraordinary discipline, the image of someone who simply doesn't know what you're asking about. But here's what changed. 3 separate developments in recent months quietly closed off the exits. First, investigators reportedly obtained communications that placed Melania in proximity to key decisions that previous testimony had suggested she was entirely uninvolved in. Not peripheral proximity, direct proximity. Second, a former White House official, someone who served in a senior capacity and who has already cooperated extensively with investigators, provided what sources describe as a detailed account of conversations Melania was present for. Conversations that contradicted the carefully maintained public narrative. Third, and this is the part that everyone missed because it was buried in a court filing nobody was watching, her legal team made a quiet procedural move in late winter that lawyers who specialize in these situations immediately recognized as a negotiating posture, not a defensive posture, a negotiating one. That's a very specific distinction. And it tells you something important about where this was heading. So what did she actually say? That's the question, isn't it? And here's where it gets complicated, because the full contents of her testimony are sealed. Officially, very little has leaked. Officially, her spokesman issued a brief, carefully worded statement saying she has cooperated fully with appropriate legal processes and has nothing further to add. That statement is doing a lot of work for 19 words. Because what legal sources are saying, not for attribution, not on the record, but with a consistency that starts to feel less like rumor and more like signal, is that Melania's testimony covered ground that nobody expected her to address. Ground that prosecutors had not been sure they could get anyone to address. Ground that connects dots that have existed in the public record for years, but that nobody could formally link. One former federal prosecutor who reviewed publicly available information about the related cases put it this way: when the spouse of a target in a complex financial and political investigation voluntarily provides testimony that goes beyond what's required, there are really only two explanations. Either they've been given a very compelling reason to cooperate, or they've made a strategic decision that their interests and their husband's interests are no longer the same thing. Both of those sentences are worth reading twice, because what they're really saying is this: either Melania was in enough legal jeopardy herself that cooperation became her best option, or she decided at some point in the last several months that protecting Donald Trump was no longer something she was willing to do. And the terrifying thing for the people around him is that they don't know which one it is. Maybe both, maybe neither, but they don't know. And in these situations, not knowing is the most dangerous thing of all. Let's talk about the marriage, because you can't tell this story without it. And everyone keeps dancing around it like it's impolite to look directly at. This has never been a conventional partnership. That much has been visible for years to anyone paying attention. The body language at public events, the separate entrances, the infamous moments caught on camera that became cultural shorthand for something everyone could see but nobody could confirm. Sources who have been in proximity to both of them over the years describe a relationship that functions less like a marriage and more like a business arrangement that has survived well past the point where both parties stopped pretending otherwise. There is respect, reportedly. There is shared interest in protecting their son. There is the shared weight of a history that neither of them can fully escape. But there is not, by multiple accounts, the kind of loyalty that makes someone fall on a legal sword for another person. Melania has reportedly been furious in private about things that have become public knowledge, not the affairs. Sources suggest she made her calculations about those long ago, but the legal exposure, the constant crisis management, the way her husband's choices have made her own life increasingly constrained and increasingly scrutinized. She moved to Palm Beach with purpose. She has maintained physical and sometimes operational distance from the campaign apparatus. She has declined events and appearances that a traditionally supportive political spouse would attend without question. Every one of those decisions has been noticed by people who track these things professionally. And then came the moment when investigators came asking questions she couldn't decline to answer without consequences. Here's the part of the story that makes experienced legal observers genuinely nervous. Not nervous for Trump, necessarily. Nervous about what it signals for everything that comes next. Spousal testimony is extraordinarily rare in cases like this, not because the law prevents it. Federal law provides for marital privilege, but it has significant limitations. If Melania was present during communications that were not solely between husband and wife, that privilege evaporates. If she was a participant in decisions rather than a passive observer, that privilege evaporates. If she made her own independent choices that have legal implications, that privilege evaporates. For years, the assumption has been that whatever Melania knows, privilege protects. But that assumption was always conditional. It was always dependent on the facts being a certain way. And facts, as this entire saga has demonstrated repeatedly, have a way of being different from what everyone assumed. The specific areas her testimony reportedly touched on, again based on sources speaking carefully and off the record, involve financial decisions made during and after the White House years, communications about the preservation and handling of certain documents, and most explosively, conversations about what various people knew and when they knew it. That last category is the one that makes prosecutors light up, because it goes to intent. And intent is everything in federal criminal law. You can dispute facts, you can dispute interpretations. But if you can establish that someone knew something was wrong and chose to proceed anyway, that's the difference between a legal gray area and a criminal conviction. If Melania's testimony speaks to what was known and by whom and when and what was decided in light of that knowledge, that is not a minor contribution to an existing investigation. That is a structural beam. Predictably, the reaction from Trump's orbit has been volcanic. Not publicly volcanic, because publicly they are maintaining a posture of calm confidence that everyone in Washington recognizes as performance. But internally, sources describe a level of alarm that goes well beyond what they've shown during previous legal crises. Previous crises had known shapes. A document dump, a cooperating witness who could be discredited, a legal argument that had at least arguable merit. Every previous challenge came with a playbook, and Trump's people are extraordinarily good at executing playbooks. This one doesn't have a playbook, because this one is Melania. And she doesn't play by their rules. She never has. The people around Trump who have privately been most confident that she would never cooperate, never say anything damaging, never trade on the access she has to information from the inside, those people are now the ones who look most shaken. Because their certainty was based on a theory of Melania that events are now suggesting was never quite accurate. They thought her silence was loyalty. They may have been wrong about what it was. Her silence may have simply been strategy. And her strategy may have changed. Let's talk about Barron, because whenever you try to understand Melania's decision-making, the thread always leads back to her son. This is not speculation. People who know her have said it explicitly, on multiple occasions in multiple contexts. Barron is the organizing principle of her life. Every major decision she makes gets filtered through what it means for him. He's 18 now. He's an adult in the eyes of the law. He's been deliberately kept away from the political spectacle that has consumed his parents' public existence. Melania has been ferocious about that. Whatever else you can say about her, her protectiveness of Barron is real, and it is not performance. And here's the question that some people who track this situation are starting to ask. What does Melania believe Barron's future looks like in the shadow of his father's ongoing legal wars? What does she think happens to him if the empire collapses in chaos? What does she think is better for a young man about to build his own life? A mother who stayed silent until silence was no longer sustainable? Or a mother who made a calculated choice at a calculated moment and secured her own position before it was too late? That is a cold calculation. It is also, depending on your perspective, an entirely rational one. And Melania Trump has, throughout her adult life, consistently demonstrated that she is capable of cold, rational calculation at moments when everyone expects emotion. She did not survive what she survived by being passive. She survived it by watching, waiting, and moving at exactly the right moment. This may be that moment. The ripple effects are already visible, if you know where to look. In the past 2 weeks, 3 separate things have happened that appear unrelated, but that legal watchers are connecting. A defense attorney on one of the peripheral cases made a motion that legal observers found puzzling until they understood it in the context of new testimony having been provided. The motion was essentially attempting to preemptively challenge the admissibility of certain witness accounts. You don't make that motion unless you know or strongly suspect that certain witness accounts have been provided and are going to matter. The second thing that happened is that one of Trump's longtime financial advisors, someone who has been publicly quiet for months, quietly updated their legal representation, changed law firms, brought in a team that specializes specifically in cooperation agreements. That is not a subtle signal. People in this world do not change to cooperation agreement specialists because they feel confident about their position. The third thing is perhaps the most telling. The tone of Trump's public statements about Melania shifted. Almost imperceptibly, but it shifted. The public praise became slightly more performative, slightly more emphatic, slightly more like a man trying to signal something to an audience of one. If you've watched enough of these situations unfold, you recognize that specific flavor of public statement. It's what it looks like when someone is trying to remind another person what they owe them in the only forum they have left. She hasn't responded publicly. She almost never does. But her silence now feels different than it used to. It used to feel like distance. Now it feels like something else entirely. Here's what has people in legal circles genuinely unsettled, beyond the immediate implications for any specific case. The precedent that this sets, the signal it sends, when the spouse of a major political figure voluntarily enters territory that spousal privilege could theoretically have protected. When they provide testimony that goes to the heart of ongoing investigations. When they do so in a way that is clearly strategic rather than compelled. It tells every other spouse of every other person under investigation something important. It tells them this is possible. It tells them this is survivable. It tells them that choosing your own legal and financial future over a partner who has put you in legal jeopardy is a thing that happens now. People are already drawing comparisons to cases they wouldn't have compared before. They're asking questions about other political marriages where one partner has more legal exposure than the other. They're wondering who else is having quiet conversations with their lawyers about what cooperation might look like. They're watching to see what happens to Melania, because what happens to her will inform what everyone else decides. This is how precedent works. Not through dramatic announcements, through one decision that changes what seems possible, and then another decision and another until the landscape looks completely different from what it was. Let me tell you what's keeping people up at night who've been inside these kinds of cases. Not the legal strategy, not the appeal arguments, not the financial maneuvering around bond amounts and property seizures. As significant as all of that is, what's keeping them up is this. Nobody knows what Melania actually said. Not completely, not in detail. The prosecutors know. Her lawyers know. The judges involved in sealing those proceedings know. And Melania knows. That's a remarkably small circle for something this consequential. And the people who most need to know, the people whose futures depend on what she said or didn't say, whose legal strategies depend on knowing exactly where their exposure now sits, those people are working with incomplete information. They're trying to build a defense against a deposition they haven't read, against testimony they can only partially reconstruct, against a variable they cannot control. In legal strategy, uncertainty is almost always worse than bad news. Bad news you can plan around. Uncertainty paralyzes you. You can't build a wall against a threat you can't fully see. Trump's legal team is operating in that uncertainty right now, and sources say it is affecting their decision-making in ways that are not helping their client. There are reports of disagreements within the defense apparatus about strategy, about tone, about how publicly to address what's happened. Every legal team has internal disagreements, but the disagreements right now are described as more fractious than usual, more personal, more desperate. Melania has given 3 public statements since reports of her testimony began to circulate. 3, each one carefully worded, each one saying almost nothing while appearing to say something, each one reinforcing the brand she has spent 20 years building. The brand of a woman who will not be defined by anyone else's narrative, who will not be rushed, who will not be panicked into saying more than she intends. She was photographed last week in Palm Beach. She looked, by every external measure, completely fine. Rested, composed, going about her life. She smiled at someone near the entrance of a restaurant. She wore something understated and perfectly chosen. She looked like a woman who has made a decision she's comfortable with. That image is doing work. It's been studied by people who track these things. It's been discussed in legal circles where people understand that public image and legal strategy are not separate things. They are the same thing at this level. Because what Melania is projecting right now is the single most dangerous thing she could project to anyone worried about what she said behind closed doors. She's projecting peace. And the only people who feel peaceful in the middle of a situation like this are people who believe they've already made the right move. Here's where things stand. The testimony exists. It's sealed. It's in the hands of prosecutors who have been building cases across multiple jurisdictions for years. Its full implications won't be visible until cases move forward, until filings are made that reference it directly, until the downstream effects become unmistakable. That process doesn't happen overnight. It happens in months, sometimes in years. The law moves slowly, which is why everyone watching right now feels the strange combination of urgency and suspended animation that defines these moments. Trump's legal team is doing what it always does, attacking the process, challenging the legitimacy of every institution involved, fundraising on outrage. The machine is running, but the machine is running on fuel it's borrowed from a future it hasn't secured yet. And somewhere in Palm Beach, in a residence that is not Trump Tower and not the White House, Melania Trump is living her life in the particular quiet of someone who has already moved through the most difficult part. Watch what happens in the next 60 days. Watch the filings. Watch the personnel changes in legal teams. Watch for the document requests that signal investigators are building towards something specific. Watch for the public statements from people adjacent to Trump that start sounding less like confidence and more like preemptive damage control. Something is building. Something has already been set in motion that cannot be unmade. The most protected woman in American political life just stopped being fully protected. And in these kinds of cases, when the wall comes down in one place, it rarely holds in the others. But here's the uncomfortable truth that this whole story forces you to confront. We've spent years watching this play out. Every scandal, every indictment, every explosive hearing, every verdict. And the lesson that keeps repeating itself is this: the people who survive these systems are almost never the ones who are most loyal. They're the ones who see the situation clearly, who understand that loyalty in political marriages, in political empires, in political machines is a transaction. And when the transaction stops serving you, the loyalty stops serving you too. Melania Trump has always been misread. The American public cast her as either a victim or a villain. And she has consistently refused to be either. She has played a longer game than anyone gave her credit for. She has maintained her position through multiple earthquakes that would have leveled anyone operating by the normal rules. Maybe this is another move in that long game. Maybe she calculated with the cold precision that has always characterized her at her most decisive, that the time had come to protect what she could protect. Her finances, her legal standing, her son's future, herself. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the testimony is less explosive than sources suggest. Maybe the ripples settle. Maybe everything looks different in 3 months than it looks right now. But here's what I know. When a woman who has said almost nothing for years suddenly finds herself in a room answering questions she could have fought harder to avoid, something has changed. Something fundamental. Something that doesn't change back. The most silent person in the most chaotic story in American political history just became a variable. And nobody, including the people who thought they understood her best, can fully predict what that means. The clock is moving, the cases are building, the ripples are spreading further than the original reporting suggested. And somewhere, in the sealed transcript of a deposition most people will never read, is the sentence, or the paragraph, or the account of a conversation that will eventually explain how this all ends. We just don't know yet what it says. But the people who need most to know it can't stop thinking about it. And that, more than any ruling, more than any verdict, more than any fine or seizure or ban, might be the most consequential thing Melania Trump has ever done. Whatever comes next, nothing about this returns to what it was. And trust me, when the next piece of this breaks, and it will break, the full picture is going to be more complicated and more consequential than anything you've already seen. We're all watching now. And this time, so is she. And here's what nobody is prepared for. Not really. And that restraint, which the world has spent years misreading as passivity, is about to reveal itself as the most sophisticated power move in this entire story. Because here's the thing about silence. When it finally ends, the words carry the weight of everything that came before them. Every year she said nothing. Every moment she stood still while the world speculated. Every carefully declined interview. Every statement released through spokespeople. Every photograph where her expression gave nothing away. All of it becomes context. All of it becomes pressure that makes whatever she eventually says hit harder than anything anyone else in this situation could possibly say. She has been building that pressure for years, maybe without fully intending to, maybe with complete intention. With Melania, you genuinely cannot tell, and that ambiguity is itself a form of power. What sources are now suggesting is that her legal team has quietly begun what one insider described as positioning conversations. Not negotiations, not cooperation agreements in the formal sense. Positioning, which means they are establishing where she stands, what she's willing to say publicly and when, and what she expects in return for continuing to say nothing beyond what's already been documented. That is a negotiation. They're just using a more elegant word for it. And the people on the other side of that conversation know it. They are dealing with someone who has watched every mistake every other person in this orbit has made, who has observed up close and in extraordinary detail exactly how these situations unravel, who understands leverage because she has lived inside one of the most leverage-dependent relationships in modern American life. She is not panicking. She is not performing. She is moving. When the next development breaks, and every indication suggests it is coming faster than the public timeline would suggest, remember this moment. Remember that the quietest person in the room was never absent from the conversation. She was just waiting for the right moment to speak at full volume. That moment is closer than anyone realizes. And when it arrives, the story everyone thought they understood is going to look completely different. Again, and that's what makes this different from every other chapter in this story. Every previous explosion came with warning signs, leaked documents, court filings appearing quietly on a docket somewhere, a source whispering to a reporter 3 weeks before the headline landed. There was always a trail you could follow backward once the news broke and say, yes, it was there, we just weren't looking at the right place. This time, there is no trail. This time, the people who would normally be the sources are themselves in the dark. The advisors who built careers on knowing things before anyone else are calling each other, asking questions nobody can answer. The attorneys who specialize in reading these situations are hedging in ways they never hedge. Even the journalists who have been closest to this story for years are publishing carefully, cautiously, without the confidence that usually accompanies reporting at this level. That absence of leaks is itself the signal. Because in Washington, in legal circles, in the world where this story lives, silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Silence means something is happening that nobody has been able to get ahead of yet. And the one person capable of producing that kind of silence, the kind that holds even when every surrounding institution is leaking, is someone who has spent decades perfecting exactly that discipline. Melania Trump did not survive what she survived by accident. She survived it by understanding something that everyone underestimated about her from the beginning, that the most powerful position in any room is not the loudest one. It is the one that everyone else keeps looking at, trying to read, unable to fully see. She has held that position for years. She is still holding it now. And the room is getting very, very quiet. And so here we are, at the end of a story that isn't finished, at the edge of a conclusion that hasn't been written yet. Watching a situation that has defied every prediction, survived every attempt to contain it, and continued expanding in directions nobody mapped in advance. But let me tell you what I actually believe. After everything we've walked through together, after the testimony, the ripples, the sealed transcripts, the positioning conversations, the silence that speaks louder than anything anyone has said publicly, I believe we are watching the slow, inevitable conclusion of something that should have concluded years ago. A reckoning that was always coming, that was delayed by money and fame and the particular genius of a man who understood how to use chaos as a shield. That shield is cracking, not because prosecutors finally got smart. Not because the legal system finally found its courage, but because the person closest to the center of it all made a calculation, a quiet, cold, precise calculation, and acted on it. That matters beyond this case, beyond this family, beyond this particular moment in American political history. It matters because it tells us something true about how power actually works. Not the version of power that gets celebrated at rallies or enshrined in gold letters on buildings. The real version, the version that operates in sealed rooms and careful silences and precisely chosen moments. The version that belongs to people who never needed the crowd's approval to feel certain about their next move. Melania Trump has never needed the crowd. That was always the thing everyone missed about her. And now, at the moment when the crowd is louder and more divided than ever, when everyone is screaming about sides and systems and who wins and who loses, she is somewhere quiet, making moves that none of us can fully see yet. That's the story. That's the real one underneath all the legal filings and the financial penalties and the appellate arguments and the campaign speeches. One woman, decades of watching, one decision made at exactly the right moment. Whatever comes next, remember where you heard it first. Remember that the quietest rooms are where the loudest decisions get made. And remember that in this story, as in most stories that actually matter, the ending belongs to the person who was patient enough to wait for it. She waited. Now watch what she does with it.